Hey everybody, welcome back. If you follow me, this has been a long time coming. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like. Now let's get to it. This past year, McFarlane Toys released a line of figures for one of my favorite movies of all time. When I saw them, I knew I needed to have them. What I was going to do with them, I wasn't quite sure yet. And that took some time to figure out. I watched every scene that the two of them were in, trying to figure out what moment I wanted to capture. And I kept coming back to the fight scene at the cliff. But initially this was going to be them mid-sword fight, just before they both revealed that they're not left-handed. After unpacking them and realizing both of them can only hold their sword in their right hand, kinda threw the original concept out the door. So unfortunately, it was back to the drawing board. A few years ago, while on Instagram, I came across a beautiful poster done by Chelsea Lowe of The Princess Bride. I'm very picky about my movie posters, and this one struck that right chord with me. I tagged her socials in the description. After staring at the poster for hours, I realized I had all this wall space next to it, so why don't I do the cliff scene just before the fight? This would be something new and different and challenging. I knew that's where I was going to go with this project. But first, the hammer. There's nothing quite like intentionally breaking something before you start your project. I knew that there were going to be elements to this project that were going to need to be suspended or to be able to hold themselves up on this piece. So I needed to get it up and off my desk so I could work on it to make sure that these pieces weren't going to fall off once I hung it on the wall. This was just a simple tower that I could hang everything on while I worked on it. Nothing too crazy. I decided ahead of time that I wanted this to sit as flush against the wall as I possibly could, and I wanted to use a French cleat to do so. So before this even started, I reached out to my carpenter friend to have him make me one. If you don't know what a French cleat is, you're gonna learn today. It's a strip of wood that's cut down the middle at a 45-degree angle. Half of it is attached to the thing that you're hanging, and the other half is attached to the wall. And when they interlock with each other, they hold your thing on the wall, as well as dispersing the weight across multiple points that you've drilled into your wall. I'm sure there's carpenters out there that are cringing or yelling at their phone or computer, but that's the best definition I got for you right now. If you have a better one, please feel free to leave it in the comments. And without fail, almost on cue, I screwed something up. Not only did I glue the cleat on backwards after testing it a whole bunch of times, but I also didn't take into account that I needed to enlarge the back plate in order for this to sit on the wall properly. That doesn't work. I thought I could just flip over that block of wood and that would solve the problem. But I was mistaken and had to tear it apart a second time. And ripping apart things once the glue has started to set is never a fun time. Now that I extended that back piece and gave it some stability, I was able to test fit it on the wall to make sure that this was going to hold everything before I started adding a whole bunch of foam to it. So now that it was structurally sound and would hold weight, I got out my new toy that I got for Christmas. This helped out immensely. I really could have used this for the Captain Marvel project. Once I had enough foam to cover up that inner structure, I began to taper it down into smaller and smaller pieces because I knew I was going to shape this thing into somewhat of a point. Now that I had the basic foam structure blocked out, it was time to go brew some coffee. Not that I was tired, but I needed to do some weathering of the rope that was going to be used. I also brewed some black tea alongside the coffee to see the different looks that it would produce. I needed to weather this rope, and I knew whatever I weathered it with needed to get deep into the fibers. This rope has clearly been sitting out in the elements for a long time. I thought the tea might actually work better. However, in the end, the coffee looked darker and richer in color. I cut the length of rope that I was going to need and let it steep in some coffee overnight. Now it was time to move on to the background. Originally, this wasn't going to have a background. It was just going to be my painted wall. This really needed something to bring us to that place. So one night, I sat down and took a whole bunch of screenshots from the movie. I then photoshopped out all the characters and filled in the background to make a clean background plate for that scene. I reached out to my local photo lab to have this printed, and it looks fantastic. I got a piece of acrylic that I cut down to the exact size of the print. I left an inch gap at the bottom where this would attach to the back of the cliff. There was one minor detail that I didn't take into account. I didn't leave space for an underhang. Is underhang even a word? We have overhangs, but do we have underhangs? I guess things are underhung. I don't know. I didn't leave space on the backside because I never intended for this thing to have a background. So I glued everything flush. This means I had to carve out a channel on that inner structure for the acrylic to be glued into. So I broke out the chisel set and went to town. Again, the woodworkers of America are probably cringing right now. Now that that was taken care of, and before I started shaping this thing, my concern was that the only thing holding the foam to the wooden structure would be glue. I wanted to add some more support lower on the structure, so I drilled a few holes through the back plate and into the foam. What I didn't account for was that the foam was going to blow apart since it was only held together by hot glue. After regretting my decision, I went and re-glued all the pieces with Mod Podge instead of hot glue this time and let everything sit overnight. I was able to insert the dowels to give it that added support, as well as my own peace of mind that it was now supported adequately. Before I glued everything together, I put it back up on the uprights and slid in the background so I could mark off where the rope from the background would connect to the inner structure. I wanted it to look as seamless as possible. I also needed to carve out a small indentation in the foam to accommodate that extra piece of rope being in there, so it all sat flush. I then took my nicely weathered rope and fed it through the hole and tied it off on the other side. That way, it can't be pulled out. I did one last test fitting to make sure everything fit together nicely, and then it was time to glue it all together. I used Mod Podge for the wood and foam pieces, as well as mixing some Sculptamold to put in the holes with the dowels just to make sure they were locked into place. I glued the top piece of foam on, and as one last, we'll call it overboard measure, I used some UV resin to seal in the dowels so this thing is never coming apart. With everything dry and locked into place, cue the carving montage. Now that the cliff face was starting to take shape, I could start building up the fortress aspect of it. If you really watch that scene, it was like an old castle or fortress that's been crumbling over time. So I had to make a lot of bricks, or rocks, or bricks that look like rocks, or rocks that look like bricks. I tried to soften the bricks with the rock technique. However, this plastic container and rocks was not the way to do it. It was so damn loud, and I'm sure my neighbors wanted to punch me, because I wanted to punch me. They did somewhat of the trick. However, I ended up doing most of the softening of the bricks by hand with one rock. It ended up looking better in the end, but it took forever. At some point, I'm going to figure out the best way to do this. I hand laid and glued each brick to form that crumbling castle wall, as well as trying to seamlessly blend them into the background. With those castle walls now glued together, I could remove them, so I could lay the whole cliff down so I could seal the foam and start painting. At first I tried to use Sculpt-A-Mold, but I'm still new to it and I couldn't figure it out. It just didn't work right for me. I had a bucket of freeform air, but it was getting old and crumbly, so that didn't work either. But I did have a whole bucket of joint compound from a home renovation project, and that did the trick. In hindsight, I don't know if that was the best thing to use. I went about painting this very differently than I would normally. I went in with a bunch of light color washes before I added the dark rock color on top of it all. Doing it in this manner scared me because this was very different than any way I had ever painted before. It was coming out heavily orange, and I had a feeling that was going to happen. The other problem that was happening was the joint compound was absorbing the water from the watered down paints and softening everything. So once I got to that level, I stopped and let it dry overnight. I came downstairs the next morning, and it wasn't quite the color that I wanted it to be. So I took one of the dark rock colors that I was going to originally paint it and dry brushed the whole thing. This darkened all the rocks down, as well as allowing for all those washes that I put on to kind of poke through in all those deep recesses. I went over it a second time just to make sure I really nailed that color that I wanted. From there, I went over all the rocks with progressively lighter shades of gray, almost hitting bright white, making sure that all the edges of the rocks really popped out against that darker background. Now that the main rock face was to my liking, I could start working on painting the castle wall pieces. I primed them with black paint and Mod Podge, and then took them outside and sprayed them down with a spray primer. They got the same treatment as the rock face, just in a lighter set of colors. While giving them a coat of black wash, of course I'd knocked over the black wash all over my desk, so that's always fun. Now that those were painted, I sprayed down a nice layer of spray Mod Podge and dumped a whole ton of ballast sand all over that. I spread it out, but also realized it shouldn't be even. There had been people walking through this, so I took Inigo's foot and I started making footprints and tracks in the sand before I locked it down with isopropyl alcohol and more watered down Mod Podge. Once this was dry, it had a very uniform tone to it all. So I took an off-white color and lightly dry brushed all the high points just to get some tonal variation in all the sand. I laid the cliff down and painted the back black for no other reason than just to cover up the white from the joint compound. Before gluing on the castle structures, I needed to attach the background. I mixed up a 2-part epoxy and spread it along that 1-inch gap that I left on the acrylic and stuck it to the cliff. I came back the next day and everything was beautifully stuck in place. I used some foam-safe glue to attach the castle structures to the top of the cliff as well as to the background. I didn't want any gaps anywhere. With all of that glued into place, it was time to add some vegetation. This was not something I had originally thought about when I conceived this. After watching this scene numerous times, there's a lot of vegetation on the rocks, on the castle structures. You just kind of don't notice it. It's there and it blends in with the environment. Once I had adequately made this place look like it's been sitting for a while unattended, I took the 2 figures outside and gave them a quick matte spray just to dull down any shininess that may be on the plastic. I then quickly dry brushed both of them with an off-white just to give that plastic a little variation and to make it look like these characters could be real. The next step was to put the characters in the scene. Also, I had to glue Inigo's sword to his belt because they didn't give him a scabbard, but I made sure to glue it on his left side because that's where he carries it. Because I wanted this piece to have life, the 2 action figures are going to be holding each other up. Inigo is going to be holding the Dread Pirate Roberts in place. there is going to be tension in that rope between the two of them, literally and figuratively. So in order to achieve that, I needed to glue small acrylic rods in the bottom of each of their feet, which will then be glued into the actual foam. This will allow for a little more rigidity and stability so that Inigo can actually be holding the Dread Pirate Roberts in place. In order for them to be holding onto the rope, I used a hairdryer to soften the plastic to be able to flex their hand open and wrap it around the rope and tack it in place with some glue. This challenged me in a multitude of ways. Not only did this challenge me to make something that hangs on a wall, which I've never done before, but it also challenged me to add characters that are literally suspended and holding each other up on this piece. Now that everything's set in place, let's go to the beauty shots. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoyed this piece. This movie means a lot to me, and I'm so happy that I got to make this. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and share it with your friends, and subscribe if you haven't already, and all that good stuff. Thank you for coming on this journey with me, and I'll see you in the next one. Until next time.